Hi, I'm Dr. Emma Katz, author of the book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, and I'm here to talk to you today about coercive control and its impacts on children. First of all, coercive control. Coercive control involves situations where somebody subjects another person or persons to persistent, wide-ranging controlling behaviour over a long period of time and makes it clear that if they stand up for themselves, the abuser will punish them. So the abuser is basically setting up a situation where it's very clear to the victim they have to do as they're told or else. The punishment used by the perpetrator may take many forms. It's not always violence, but it will be something that the perpetrator knows the victim dreads, such as cruel verbal put-downs, hurting loved ones, or forcing unwanted forms of sexual activity on the victim. By repeatedly punishing the victim for non-compliance, the perpetrator intends to demoralize and terrorize the victim into a state of permanent obedience. Domestic abuse has been estimated to cost our economy 66 billion annually. But that estimate does not even include the impacts on children, as these have been considered too complex to account for. The perpetrator of coercive control is motivated by their deeply held and harmful drive to obtain control over the other persons in their family and to maintain that control for as long as they want it. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. For the perpetrators, this drive to control is so strong that it tends to dominate their whole life. Much of their time is spent pursuing the control that they seek and cultivating a positive public reputation for themselves that will reduce the likelihood of anyone believing or rallying around their victims should their victims come forward and ask for help. The impacts on the family will include confusion, self-doubt, self-blame, blaming the other victims, low self-esteem, trauma, PTSD, physical illness, economic deprivation, having a feeling of always walking on eggshells, trying to please the perpetrator, not being able to exercise self-determination over key areas of their lives. There may also be attempts from victims to fight back, resist, speak the truth about what is happening, and protect themselves and other victims in the family from further harm. The extent to which victims and survivors fight back varies depending on the circumstances and what they can safely do. Coercive control is mainly perpetrated by men. For example, research by Michael Johnson and colleagues in the US found that 22% of women had experienced coercive control from ex-husbands, but 5.4% of men had experienced coercive control from ex-wives. The analysis of the crime survey for England and Wales by Andy Myhill found that out of a group of women and men who reported to the survey they'd experienced some kind of domestic abuse, 30% of the women, but only 6% of the men had experiences severe enough to be called coercive control. That is, their partners had repeatedly belittled them to the point of making them feel worthless and made them feel frightened by threatening to hurt them. And 97% of perpetrators convicted for controlling and coercive behaviour in England and Wales in the year ending December 2020 were males. Now let's look at the impact on children and young people. Research evidence from multiple countries highlights that male coercive control and domestic abuse perpetrators are usually harmful fathers or father figures. Perpetrators have substantially elevated rates of physically, psychologically, and sexually abusing and neglecting the children in their care. Perpetrators may also stalk, threaten, and terrorize their children as part of their campaign of abuse against ex-partners. The child of a perpetrator may experience the perpetrator rigidly and malevolently controlling their daily activities, excessively controlling and limiting their contact with friends and family, hurting their beloved pets, and depriving them of access to money and resources that are normal for their age. I have done research specifically on children and coercive control. I interviewed with 15 mothers and 15 of their children who had experienced coercive control. Although interestingly, I didn't know that they'd experienced coercive control when I recruited them into the study. they were recruited just on the basis of being domestic abuse victims. I never said coercive control specifically, but it turned out that every single one of them had experienced coercive control. The children who I interviewed, their ages ranged usually from between 10 and 14 years old, with the exception of one 20-year-old young man who still lived with his mum and wanted to take part and did end up taking part. The children who were interviewed were 9 girls and 6 boys, because that's just what they happened to be in those families. And the perpetrators had all been the children's biological father or their stepfather. All of the interviewees were living in the community and were separated from perpetrators at the time they took part in the research. And this is what I found. Control of time and movement really affected the children. So fathers demanded high levels of attention from mothers at the expense of the children, and they stopped the mothers and the children from spending time together. My daughter Leah used to want me to sit and brush her hair, but that wasn't allowed because he'd be jealous. He'd say things like, "You've spent enough attention on her, what about my attention?" It felt like mum wasn't there because I didn't spend time with her or anything. When mum was giving me attention, he'd tell her to go over to him, so she'd have to leave me to play by myself. So here we can see that father's coercive control was limiting the amount of maternal attention that children could enjoy and reducing opportunities for fun and affection in their homes. The children described feeling sad and annoyed and angry at these situations, and some children started to have doubts about whether or not their mother loved them. Children were also affected by the father's tendency to isolate the mother from the outside world. Because when fathers controlled mothers' movements outside the home, this also severely restricted children's social lives. It prevented children from engaging with wider family, peers, and extracurricular activities. The kids couldn't have any friends round because he'd kick off or something. And kids' parties were another problem because he'd be accusing me of trying to have sexual relations with one of the dads. So parties were out of the question. We couldn't do any after-school clubs because he insisted I had to be back home by a certain time, and the clubs finished after that time. Me and the kids weren't allowed to go round to see their grandparents. So here we can see the multiple benefits that positive experiences with grandparents, friends, and after-school clubs can have on children's social skills and their confidence and their development were being denied to these children by their fathers or their stepfathers. Because of their father's behaviour, many of the children were living in the same isolated, lonely worlds as their mothers. It was just school and home, school and home, school and home. This was especially the case for younger children who, of course, are more reliant on their mothers to facilitate their access to friends' houses, playgrounds, days out, etc. Some perpetrators deprived mothers and children of resources and even imprisoned them. And these extreme tactics for depriving the family of freedom, independence, and resources impacted on children as well as mothers. Now we're going to hear from one mother and her 20-year-old son. They wanted to be interviewed together and they chipped in on each other's answers. He'd tell us that we couldn't touch the food in the fridge, that we weren't allowed to eat. He'd lock us in the house a lot of the time so we couldn't get out. He'd unplug the phone. He'd take the power out because in the hall we've got an old electric box where you can take things out and that's it, you've got no power. He used to take an element out the central heating so we'd have no heating. He'd lock us in the house and go out. He'd take the modem so John couldn't do his homework and I couldn't do my banking on the computer. So we were prisoners in a way. This highlights how some fathers were directly and purposefully extending their coercive controlling abuse over their children, as well as over their girlfriend or wife. Children were also affected by the constrained behaviour that the perpetrator demanded from them. Many children reported that they could not say and do normal age-appropriate things in their homes when the coercive controller was there. They had to constrain their own natural behaviour as children to comply with their father's demands. When he came home from work, he'd want to spend time with them, and they were always his girls. He used to say to Zoe, "You're my little angel." But at the same time, they couldn't shout, they couldn't make noise, They couldn't be children around him unless it was on his terms. It was all right if he wanted to play with them, but at other times, it was like he wanted them to disappear. I would be sort of quiet. I didn't shout out or run around. Wouldn't it be great if mums leaving these dads was enough to make the children safe and end the coercive control? But so often it is not. Because coercive control perpetrators don't tend to respect their partner's decision to end the relationship, and they typically continue in their efforts to control and dominate their partner's life and/or punish them for trying to break free. And this too has severe impacts on children. He used to bring some other men to the house, and me and my brothers feared for our lives because he used to smack on the doors and I used to hide. So again, drawing on my research, this is what children themselves reported about their father's post-separation behaviour. My dad's injunction ran out and he kept turning up at the house. Then he wrote something on the back door. He wrote "dead bitch." And my mum tried to get it removed before we could see it, but I saw it before it got removed. These terrifying actions from fathers could make children's and mothers' lives frightening and unpredictable. Fathers' actions drastically limited the safe space available to children and mothers, often leaving them under siege. And it was evident from the interviews that this frightening fathering undermined children's mental health and their well-being, their physical security, and their education. Perpetrators would also use something that in my 2020 paper I term admirable fathering as part of their ongoing attempts to control ex-partners and children. They chose to present themselves as admirable fathers to school staff, other parents, wider communities, both online and offline, and professionals and courts. So whether this was on Facebook or at the school gates, they were putting on the persona of the admirable father. And this could include playing the role of being a caring father, a committed father, or a vulnerable victim father, or perhaps all three. But whatever it was always a father deserving of praise and support. And this appeared to be part of the perpetrator's strategy to increase their own power while further marginalising and weakening their ex-partner, who then becomes thought of negatively in their community. Some perpetrators directed performances of admirable fathering at their children, for example, by claiming to be vulnerable victims. During our weekend visits to him, he'd say, "Your mum makes me cry, your mum makes me do this stuff, I can't see you because of your mum." And he paints such a bad picture of her. He blamed her and us for everything. He said he was on antidepressants because I wasn't seeing him often enough. I felt very small and bad. After our weekend visits with our father, my sister Zoe would be off school most Mondays because she felt so ill. She was on the sofa being held by mum and crying. He would call my sister Zoe and say, "You're the only one who really loves me." I was just so drained and I felt like crying all the time. And it's worth noting here that these weekend visits were family court ordered, and what the perpetrator's doing here, which could be considered psychological abuse, probably wouldn't have been enough to get the family court to reconsider those visits because the children weren't being beaten, but the impact it's having on the children, you can see, is so severe, and they're missing school because of it, and they're drained and they feel like crying all the time. They feel small, they feel bad. So it's really very significant. And here, what was actually going on was this father was producing guilt trips in his daughters, refusing to take responsibility for his own emotional state. By presenting himself as a vulnerable victim, he was coercing his daughters into maintaining relationships with him that were harmful to their well-being. By making his children feel as though they were responsible for his welfare, he was disguising the emotional power that he was actually wielding over them. Many children experience their father as a constantly negative presence in their post-separation lives, whether they saw him frequently or not. Those children who did not see their father frequently were still aware that nothing was stopping him reappearing in their lives at any point and causing further harm. And this left the children in a continual state of anxiety and worry and harmed their ability to live normal lives. Children often feared that they might encounter their father and be harmed by him, and this could lead to panic attacks, bedwetting, and nightmares. Some children described monitoring their surroundings continuously as a protective strategy. I have to have it, so I check that the doors are locked and the windows closed. Children also sought to increase their own and their mother's security by remaining with her. So here we have a 12-year-old boy, Bob, saying, "Now sometimes I'll sleep in my mum's bed because I feel more comfortable there and I feel more safe sleeping there." And obviously we wouldn't normally see 12-year-old boys sleeping in their mum's beds, but sleeping by himself felt too scary, too uncomfortable, unsafe, because he knew his father was out there and could appear at any time to cause him harm. And as another child said, sometimes we weren't able to go to school. I didn't want to leave my mum alone for the day. And this child also elaborated, although I don't have the quote here, that there was this constant worry about pets when they did go to school, because they didn't know whether they would come home and find their pets alive or dead. And they were very aware that dad could come into the home while they were gone and kill their pets. So when they were sitting at school, that was what was preoccupying their thoughts. It's important before we finish to note that mothers being targeted by coercive controllers tend to do what they can do to keep their children as safe and okay as possible. And mothers were making huge efforts to try and keep their children as safe and okay as possible. But of course, their ability to do this can be limited by the father's determination to abuse in ways that harm the children. Even though mothers cannot stop the father's choices to use harmful behaviour, positive parenting for mothers is still a major factor in helping children to cope with the father's domestic abuse. If you ask children themselves, who is your most important source of support, who has helped you to cope with this, they're most likely to say, "It was my mum." Mothers are cited by children who've lived with domestic abuse as their most important source of help more than anyone else in their lives. Their relationship with their mother is most children's major support in coping. So to conclude, coercive control is a severe form of abuse, and perpetrators of coercive control cause high levels of harm and high costs. Coercive control perpetrating fathers tend to parent their children in negative ways and subject their children to coercive control in ways that profoundly harm the children's day-to-day experience of life. Mothers separating from fathers is unlikely to be enough to make the children safe, as fathers tend to be determined to continue their coercive control post-separation. The problem lies with the perpetrator. Tackling the problem means tackling the perpetrator, holding them accountable, curbing their ability to continue abusing, and helping the adult and the child victims and survivors to be safe, really safe, not just safe on paper, not safe in theory, but so safe that you can actually ask them, "How do you feel?" And they say, "We feel safe." And that's where we need to get to. So just to let you know, my book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, is going to be published in August 2022. And if you buy it direct from the publisher, you can get 30% off. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Dr. Emma Katz. Please feel free to email me and also follow me on Twitter, where I'm very active. And finally, these are the references that I've drawn on today. I hope you found this a useful talk and that you have a good rest of the festival.